All right, so we're continuing on with the impact of the Industrial Revolution. We've seen lifestyle changes and social dynamics changing within families. We talked about government systems changing. The rise of socialism actually connected to the Industrial Revolution, as men like Karl Marx, for instance, thought of the factories and the capitalistic societies as pushing us towards the final cause or the final stage of history towards what he thought would be a utopian future after a violent revolution. Um, there's no doubt that a lot of things change for good, but one of the first things we're going to focus on then today is the way that the industrial nations in the West abused nations in the southern hemisphere and in the eastern hemisphere. This is a map of, as you can see, colonies in Southeast Asia in 1895. Notice some rather small European nations had come to actually dominate the globe. In 1895, the Spanish had lost a great deal of their empire in what we might call the New World. Central and South America had slowly but surely been winning their independence, but the Spanish still held a few colonies, and the Philippines were one of them. The French had given up most of their New World holdings, but were now focusing colonial power in Southeast Asia and what's called French Indochina. This would be Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And they were also in Africa, as we're going to see. But notice that you also have some smaller nations like the Portuguese, who still held some colonial holdings here in the what is today Indonesia. And then this larger swath of land is held by the Dutch East Indies, and then of course you have the British. And what they were doing is basically gathering resources for their industrial machinery in their own country. Uh, Notice they are small nations themselves. They don't have the resources that they need to support their industry, so they go elsewhere to take it. This turns out to be one of the main um, frustrations and even claims by leaders in Southeast Asia, a man named Ho Chi Minh, who will lead the Vietnamese against Japan, and then against the French, and then eventually even against the United States, was quite angered at the idea that the resources of Vietnam were being taken to support the French rather than the Vietnamese, and that's a fairly universal story. This storyline becomes a little bit more stark if you realize, for instance, that India was controlled by the British at the same time, a massive subcontinent of 1 billion people, and England controlled it. And a lot of that was the same sense of feeding the industrial machine. But I think the most stark and maybe startling picture of this is when we look at Africa. The continent of Africa is massive. Several other continents would fit inside of Africa quite easily. But you'll notice that essentially the entire continent had been colonized by the late 1800s. Two exceptions. You have Liberia over here, which had been essentially created to resettle slaves who had been freed back in Africa. That was a movement prior to the Civil War, and some people still moved in that direction after the Civil War. And then over here, Ethiopia. Although you'll notice that what is today Ethiopia, the coastline was still controlled by the Italians and the French. And that is significant. Having access to the sea is beneficial to any nation. But just look at this. The British had a swath of Africa, and then including some holdings in what is West Africa. The French controlled almost the entire Northwest, right? You have even tiny Belgium controlling a massive area, what is today the Congo, the Germans, the Spanish. And what is really terrible about this is that it's not just about industry. It starts to become about cultural, um, really a sense of racism. We talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about slavery, but in a lot of ways, it's true to say that slavery caused racism rather than racism causing slavery. And here, you could say the same thing about colonization. There were economic um, motivations, of course, but here we can see colonization causing racism rather than racism causing colonization. Although by this time, in the late 1800s, um, there were pretty widespread feelings of racial superiority for Europeans and North Americans. So what we end up seeing then is the industry that gave North America and Europe sort of economic advantage led them to feel culturally superior, which led them to justify their actions towards Southeast Asia and Africa. The colonial actions here are reprehensible. Belgium is actually quite famous for how terrible they were to the Congolese. You wouldn't think, this country of Belgium, known for bicycles and waffles and fries and chocolate, and they were almost, you might say, genocidal, actually, in their colonization of the Congo. And many of them were doing these things in the vein of what they thought of as cultivating and civilizing these places. Rudyard Kipling at the time wrote the Jungle Book about his experiences, well, his insight and his perspectives growing up in India, actually. And if you think about Mowgli as this uncivilized child, and that eventually they're trying to help this child be civilized, you could see that's how Rudyard Kipling thinks about the people of India, that the British have this burden to take care of and help civilize the rest of the world, which is terribly uncivilized. He says it much more directly in a poem called The White Man's Burden, which was written by him regarding the Philippines and the United States taking the Philippines from the Spanish. And his effort there was, again, the same ideal, this cultural superiority, the sense that Europe, because they were economically superior, more powerful, then they should be culturally more powerful. And so he said basically the United States should colonize the Philippines because they are, quote, half devil and half child. That's what he says in his poem, and really need the guidance of the Americans who are culturally superior. So we start to realize that the Industrial Revolution has some very negative connotations as people come to um, their sense of superiority and enact that superiority over the rest of the world. So what we can maybe start to discern here are some very dangerous precedents. One, we have competition over resources. The European nations go to war pretty naturally, pretty easily, unfortunately. And we've seen that throughout our course. And now we have one more reason for them to go to war, competing over resources. And what you're going to start to see is people are going to start to realize, oh, if I defeat that nation in war, I also get their colonies. And there's going to be sort of a heightened motivating factor there going to war. There's heightened rivalries then. Nations that maybe already didn't get along historically now have a renewed sense of rivalry. More than that, they have a sense of superiority, racism and superiority that's heading towards what we call social Darwinism. By the late 1800s, Charles Darwin has done his work, and it's certainly not fair to lay the blame at his feet entirely on this, but what people began to do is apply his ideas for how life developed and diversified on our planet. They took that and applied it to society, and they said, okay, well, if there are certain life forms that are more fit to survive than others, then maybe there are certain societies that are more fit to survive than others. And so social Darwinism began to basically say, we need war to weed out the weak. We need colonization to weed out the weak. The basic idea being, if the country is strong enough to dominate another country, it ought to dominate the other country, because that will perpetuate evolution and bring about an improvement of society, weeding out the weak. So we have this hyper-nationalism that comes out of it. Every country has to prove their worth. It's not just about taking care of your citizens anymore. It's about proving that you are demonstrably superior. And this kind of nationalism led to what I call atmospheric conditions for World War I, where there's a constant rhetoric of superiority and a degrading of other cultures and other countries. And one of the things that combines that with industrial power is militarism. With the Industrial Revolution, countries began to realize, oh, we can actually invent ways to crush one another militarily much more efficiently. And so weapons are going to be actually invented and manufactured at unprecedented levels, and armies are going to grow to unprecedented heights. And all of this is going to lead to a certain tension that we're going to show leads us straight into World War I. So I do think actually you can connect the dots between Industrial Revolution to World War I. It doesn't have to be that way, because clearly there are a lot of really wonderful things that come out of industry, and we'll take a look at those later. But the real connections that we can see between World War I happening and the Industrial Revolution are undeniable. The competition over resources, these rivalries developing, the ability to tear one another down through larger and more deadly militaries are all going to be a part of the puzzle that leads us to World War I. So the impact of the Industrial Revolution is massive. We've already seen it changes family dynamics, and certainly there's different views on whether it was good or bad for women that the Industrial Revolution took place. Really massive social and cultural change. I'm going to be putting a worksheet up. It'll be the last thing for the year. It'll be due Tuesday, and I hope that it won't cause you too much stress as we're wrapping up school here. Pretty much close to being done. So just keep tracking for a few more days and you're there.